let's get the show on the road. Thank you all for coming. My name's Peter White. I'm the head of First Nations Cultural Engagement for Museums of History New South Wales, and welcome to another First Nations speaker series, of course brought to you with our partners GML Heritage and the ANU Research Centre for Deep History. But before going too much into it, just like to start with acknowledging country. Here at the Museum of Sydney, the site of First Government House, before all of that, of course, was, is and still Gadigal country. And I'd like to just pay my respects to the Gadigal people. As I always say, the people who were here, the first people of that first contact of those people who came and never went away. And what we do here is moving towards actually that greater understanding and appreciation of history, but that shared history that we always have had, but unfortunately hasn't been brought to the forefront. And I sort of hope that this little chat that I'm going to have with our very special guest here will go towards a new way of bringing in listening, understanding, appreciating, and also acting on some of the wisdom of a First Nations voice brings, not only to this city, but this country and to the world. So once more, paying my respects to Gadigal, the lessons we've learnt from them, the lessons that we've still to learn from them. And it's not just about resilience and as a museum, what normally happens of memorialising people, but embracing those lessons and understanding the current people, but more importantly, the future. So with that, I'd like to formally introduce our once more esteemed guest, Rhoda Roberts AO. I don't have to give too much introductions, but renowned artistic director. And might I say, to set the scene, it's telling that we have Rhoda here in a museum, and what museums are normally thought of as places of treasures, because we have a living treasure here.
I thought you were going to say relics.
A living treasure. And I'd just like to say, unfortunately, I don't think on past ways of museums have treated our treasures, we certainly won't be doing that tonight. But I'd just like to throw, if you would like to say anything in regards to country or...
Well, Jingalali, Widaware, Jugan, Widjabul, Jumba, Balagamir, Garama, Nalibar, Garama, Ma, Jugan, Gadigal. It is quite incredible, isn't it? Here we are on Gadigal lands, and thank you, Peter, for inviting me. But here at this museum, which holds so much important history and learnings for us, and I'm always amazed because often you'll hear people go, oh yeah, we're in the city. We need to go out on country. Well, we are on country. And beneath the mortar, more so here than anywhere, we know what was in the past. And I always look at the Gadigal and go, it's quite extraordinary. It says everything about what culture and those eons of storytelling, how they remain that memory and mapping that we today, one, know what the local place was, the belonging of those people when there was this absolute, thinking that we could get rid of them. And yet here we are honouring not only those ancestors, but the people who live here on country, still on their same country, whether they're Dharawal, Gadigal, Daruk and so forth. And that astounds me, and actually it gives you a bit of a lift, because you say, we might have lost a little bit, but oh my God, those remnants are so important. And so I really feel for the Gadigal, because they were, and of course, Mob out at La Perouse and so forth, that abrupt front that would have been in their world in the space of 8 years, how their world would have changed. And so they laid down enormous legacies. And I think it's wonderful, this museum. You know, the minute you walk in, I'd love you to tell me a little bit. You know, when you walked in the door and you looked to your right, I love all those beautiful paintings that were done when that first fleet came in, because they were literally painting what they saw. But to be able then to put the transcripts of what authority and their perceptions of humanity that were written either in legislation or as documents of, what would they be, instructions of how they should behave on this land. And there was actually an instruction I saw when we came through the door.
Yeah, it's an excerpt of the Governor Phillips' instructions that was given to him by Lord Sydney on behalf of the Privy, on behalf of the Privy Council, and it's the instructions about going, to set up this new colony down in the south. Funnily enough, that was given to Governor Phillip, Philip at the time, on the 25th of April, 1787. So that date still, even before Gallipoli has quite a significance. But for us here in as a site of First Government House and those early days of the colonial project, as I call it, the significance that not many people know about those instructions. It was 9 pages long. With lots of, about stopping off and picking up supplies and that. But the excerpt that we actually did put up is his instructions of what to do with the people that were here to reach conciliation, to make good. We unfortunately only have the copy, and these come from the British Records Office. So it's the draft instructions, because if the real instructions were sort of misplaced by Philip, probably who knows where. But it also says a bit, because what we actually, if you go down and see that, when it says to reach, conciliation and good affection, blah, 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 with the savages, which then was crossed out and written natives. So even back then it was like an awareness, we better be a bit politically correct here and all of that. But I think the important thing of that is, and not only reaching good, if there is anyone who is the newcomers who disrupts these people, and their several occupations, I think the direct quote was, the full punishment of our law will be exerted on them. So immediately these are the instructions, these are the official records that weren't, before this place even existed, this new colony and all of that, directing of this. So when you put that in the context, well, okay, we know that things didn't quite go that way, but also this whole thing of terra nullius and that we've had to go through, that there wasn't anyone here. Well, what? So I think in that, it's the history that we don't know about and the experiences and how we actually address that. And I think having conversations, that's what this is all about. But this is why tonight is so important, the shared lived experiences, but also based on our history and the history that goes before us, because that's the great thing about Aboriginal people, and that we have this continuity. So I guess in going forward and acknowledging that this is NAIDOC week, and for me personally, NAIDOC week's a bit, why do we need just 1 week to celebrate Aboriginal culture? We should be doing it every day, and a lot of people are doing it, a lot of the times. And of course, as I said, we have this living treasure here that, develops so much to share with so many, not only locally, but right through to internationally. But the NAIDOC theme for our elders, and for me, Rhoda has been one of my elders for probably 30 odd years, that grounding, that conversation, but also to so many Aboriginal people and other people, particularly in the arts and cultural world, but right across. And to honour you and this NAIDOC theme of 4 Our Elders, but I'd like to throw over to you and, can you talk about the elders in your life? And I know you have, I don't know whether they call it, a great pedigree or that, but there's some very significant that I've had the honour, particularly your dad, and being as a young fellow, unfortunately for a lot of it around sorry business and that, and the role that he played within particularly those coastal communities and that, but also your mum and all of that. But the importance of elders of, not only passing on knowledge and steering and guiding, but being the centre core. Can you share some of that?
I can. There's so many elders, but there's so many custodians. And I see quite a difference between the elder and the custodian, but they're just as important. For me, the custodians are those people who inherit those birthrights to continue cultural knowledge, the boss men and boss women of story, because they retain so much. They're literally like our bush professors or our scientists and so forth. So I really respect them. And I'll name a few shortly. It's so hard because there's so many, and if you miss someone, oh my God. But also with eldership, I always see that it's quite extraordinary. It's that wisdom that comes with lived experiences. But if I look at some of our senior people, they bring a cultural humility because they realise they're just this one little thing in this incredible universe. And they're almost like, they're the vessel to guide people. So I see them as our guides. And we learn so much from them. But they watch you, they clock you. Man, can they read body language? They've learnt so much how to either be diplomats or go in for it or, to show you the way. And there used to be this old saying where, when we were allowed to go and do those sorts of annual ceremonies where it would be really about land maintenance. So we have a very special place called Lillian Rocks, and it's a spring, of course, and fresh water. And so the ladies used to go all the time and they stomp down all the grasses around the water hole and pull out all the logs and things like that had come down through the floods or whatever. So they were making that waterhole pristine again. But every time they would stamp down those grasses, they would say, we're making the path smoother and easier for the next generation. And I guess for me, that's what elders... And if I was to look at, say, New South Wales, there's so many elders, but people that have really guided me, I always remember Auntie Margaret Tucker. Sadly, she's passed away. And oh my God, she used to always bring a ukulele, and she was part of the whole Aborigines Progressive Association. It was during the days of the lead up to Fakatsi, and I'd always hear her singing and stuff, but then they'd have these huge conversations. But she was this incredibly dignified. She actually reminded me of Katharine Hepburn. She was so dignified, and the way she spoke with this really clipped English accent. She was so kind. And years later, my dad bought me this book called If Everyone Cared. And if you get a chance, go and get that book. It is just extraordinary. It really had an effect on me when I was like 15 or 20 or whatever. I was young. And in the book, she talks about how, she was taken to Cootamundra and then put out for, domestic servitude. There was a big thing across Sydney with all the rich new houses going up and rich white people. They needed a maid. So while Scotty said we didn't have any slavery, I've got to say, actually, we need to unpack that truth-telling, because They did get paid, but it was to the Aborigines Protection Board, and they never ever received those wages. So it was in a form of slavery. But so she's working for this rich white family, and the white wife, God bless her, she must have felt so misplaced and unhappy with her circumstances. So, of course, she took it out on the native girl. And so she would take her to the clothesline every morning and hose her down naked. And next to the house, there was a group of Italian labourers working on a new build of the house next door. And they jumped the fence and took off their shirts and covered Auntie Margaret, who was a young girl, you know, you can imagine. And she said it was their act of kindness that gave her faith that there was humanity. And she was the most generous and forgiving, and that's eldership, the ability to be able to forgive and then share the knowledge. And I think a lot of our elders do that. But someone else who had a real, and look, Nana Walker, oh my God, Pat O'Shane, Lowitja O'Donoghue, actually dated my dad. She said to me once, "Did you know your father and I were very fond of each other?" Extraordinary guide, extraordinary she was. You know, when she was the commissioner at ATSIC, and you can imagine how busy she was, always took that time to just sit with you, put her hand on your leg and go, "How are you going?" You know, she just great care. But one of the other, and look, there are so many, Faith Bandler. I mean, there's so many from my local community, as well as, you know, my grandmother, you know, living in shanty. She lived in a shanty called Cubberwee. My grandfather did a walk-off in 1934 or 5 from Cabbage Tree Island because the mission man at the time obviously wasn't coping, and they used to call it his Blue Moon days. So he would go off and get, and you know, open the boot of his car and unpack all this grog, and then he'd lower the blinds, and they knew he was going to have a binge for the next, which was fantastic because then they could do, you know, teach the kids dance and all that sort of stuff and language. But he was one of those men from the protection board that treated my grandfather like a child, and he said, "I refuse to be treated like a child." And he said, "The native of this country demands the right to be heard." And so in the middle of the night, he asked all the families on Cabo who wanted to walk off. And people were really frightened because they knew their kids could be taken and the laws at that time. But 3 families did, and they rode in, took all their belongings and went off and you know, rode across the river and got near Wardell and then walked all the way to Lismore. And anyway, sorry, I'm big, long-winded. They built this place called Cubberwee, which in our language means place of plenty. And it was quite extraordinary. And my grandmother, it wasn't until my partner built a house for the Carvins, and they wanted this mud brick house, and he did the floor. And I remember going to look at the house, and I went, "Oh, that floor." And it was a rammed earth floor, and I realised it was what my granny had in her shanty. She polished that floor every day. But of course, it was an eyesore, so the Lismore Council came and bulldozed it. My grandmother, that house was her pride, and they bulldozed it because she was a dirty black on the outskirts of Lismore. So devalued. But she raised my cousin, who was the first Aboriginal to be signed to an Olympic team. And from Cubberwee, he went out to the world. And so my granny is one of those senior women who held her head up high and made a home against everything. And she always had that optimism. You can do anything. You can travel the world. So that eldership of just constantly lifting you up. But I guess if I was to name someone else, it would actually be Auntie Murri Bashir. She's an extraordinary elder. So eldership isn't just about Aboriginal. It's about someone like her who actually comes from the earth of the Wiradjuri and knows that country and then guided us when she was governor of this state. And honestly, she'd have so many blackfellas at Government House. And elders are about inclusivity. Anyway, I'll shut up now because, you know.
Well, I'll just pick up like Kabawi, because I think I have mentioned to you the other part of Museums of History New South Wales State Records. We actually have the records of Kabawi School that your grandfather actually established. So even in terms of that, back then the importance of education and that two worlds was so important. But you also mentioned your grandmother and her, to go internationally and all of that. And which throws open, it's always a question that I wanted to ask you. I know your early career as a nurse, and it took you to London, and then all that time you spent, travelling the world. Did that influence you or benefit you in the work to come later on, particularly looking at our culture and what it means to be on the world stage and where you've taken it?
Yeah, it did, actually. You mentioned education. The big thing was get an education, then you can fight the system. So, we were always fed this political propaganda by our parents that the world was going to be this amazing place. And it was a pretty amazing place for where we grew up. I wanted to be a writer and a journalist, but I was told that would not be possible.
Prove that wrong.
Huh?
Prove that wrong.
Yes, well, yes. So I was told what newspaper would employ a half-caste Aboriginal and a girl at that. And so you'd be far better to get a more sensible job. And so I had for 4 years during my high school period, every Saturday, I was a candy striper at our local hospital. And so it became evident that I had to be the nurse. And so I applied to the local hospital. I can't believe it. I actually finished school. My mother came with me for the interview. And it's the first time I've ever actually heard my mother lie. Because she was a devout religious woman. And so I've been candy striping at this hospital for 4 years, every week. And, you go in and write letters for the old people. You'd read them letters, you'd feed them. It was just nice. It was care. I learnt so much about the stories, across the district. And so I applied to become a registered nurse. And when we did the interview, Matron Young, who bloody well knew me, goes, "Oh, hello, dear. So you want to be a nurse's aide?" "No, I want to be a registered nurse." "Look, I don't think that's possible. You know what your people are like. You'll be out on that mission with 10 kids by the time you're 30, and why would the government waste money to train you? But being a nurse's aide, you could help, And my mother went, "Oh, well, I'm so sorry." And my mum had piercing blue eyes, and that's all I remember is looking at my mother, piercing blue eyes, and she looked at this woman and went, classless. "My daughter will have to take up the position she has at North Shore Hospital," which back then was the hospital to train at. Not anymore. And so we'll have to take her to Sydney, but we wanted her to stay in the local region since she's been volunteering at this hospital for 4 years. But the matron wouldn't budge, and so I had to come to Sydney. I didn't go to North Shore. They didn't want me. I went to Canterbury Hospital, which really grew me. I grew up overnight. It was quite extraordinary. And I remember when I arrived there and everyone's going, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, Lismore." And they're going, "Lisbon? And I'm going, no, Lismore. I didn't know that was in Spain. And so people just assumed, because I was training at Canterbury Hospital, that I was multicultural. So it was quite interesting. But yes, I started life as a nurse. I graduated, and I wanted to come home every 6 months, but I dug my heels in because if I did go home, then I would be typical. They never lasted anything. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do this nursing for you guys, but once I've done it, I'm going to become a journalist. And so I ended up graduating. I really loved accident and emergency, casualty, we called it in those days. And so after I finished, I worked for about a year, and then I wanted to save up to go overseas. So I went and worked on an island resort called Royal Hayman Island Resort. And so I went to go waitress because that was the job they were offering. And a week later, I was the nurse on the island. There was no doctor, and it was quite extraordinary. And it really changed me as well to have, God, I was so young, and to have that responsibility. And so I used to get in my little tinny all by myself, and I would go to Hamilton, which wasn't developed. They were just starting to build it. And so I would go to Hamilton. I don't think there was any women on Hamilton. And I would do a clinic for all the young men working on Hamilton Island. And then I'd get in my dinghy and come back to Hayman. It was extra. I wouldn't do it today. Oh, my God. I can't believe I did it.
So, and then you went to London.
Then I went to London. So the idea of going to Hayman was to save money. I saved $52,000. I know, right? Oh, my God. And so my father goes, so I go home to spend like a few months with him before I head off to London. And my father's driving me around. He goes, we're just going to go down to Byron Bay. I'm like, oh, yeah. Because you've got to remember, Byron was a very poor place. It had the abattoirs, the whaling had closed down, it had the piggery, it had the Norco factory, it smelt, it was dirty. And anyway, so we're driving down the main road of Byron, and it was just on that cusp where it was starting to be gentrified and developed. And there was this fibro house with a huge, it must have been on an acre. And Dad goes, look at that, you should buy that. And I remember looking at this house, and he's organised it with the real estate to go and look at it. And I'm looking at this house, and all I could think of was the yard and how would I mow it if I was overseas. And I said, no, Dad, I'm not buying a house. Oh, my gosh. I drive past that house now. It's been very gentrified. It was sold a couple of years ago for 1 point something. Like, Jesus, I should have been a property developer. Should have listened to my father. But anyway, I travelled overseas and had a fabulous time, learnt a lot. I actually became very proud of Australia when I was overseas. Because when I first went to work as a nurse there, and I went to do a second certificate in accident emergency at the Westminster Hospital, and Australian nurses had the best reputation for their training. So I was incredibly proud to be an Australian nurse. But I started writing and doing things like that. And serendipity, one night with my girlfriends, I go to a dinner party and there's a woman there and they're all trendy, they're all being. I'm like, oh, yeah, hi, yeah, darling, hi, fabulous. And she said, oh, yeah, I'm going back to Australia to do this film. And I said, all right. She said, yeah, the only problem is it's Aboriginals. Yes. And she said, we can't find any Aboriginal actors. And I said, well, that's a load of bullshit. Have you heard of Justine Saunders? And so the discussion started, and it was this film they were making called The Fringe Dwellers. And so by the time I get back to Australia, actually Bruce Beresford was a gentleman and I got an audition. So then I was starting to move out of nursing. Sorry, I'm all over the place.
No, and haven't looked back. And I think, yeah, that call back to country, Australia, but also those links. It'd be interesting, like a lot of your work from then, and also, we always are grounded in country. But particularly the festivals that you've developed and shared with the rest, that connection to country of bringing gatherings back on country. Can you tell how important is that to give it? Instead of just having a good group of people to come with some entertainment to have a good time, because that's never really been what you've done.
Yeah, I've been so lucky, honestly. With that 52 grand I'd saved, I got so terribly homesick. So every year I would come home for 6 weeks, and I started seeing this shift. It's funny how you don't see it when you're here, but when you come back. And so I started seeing that shift. And by the time I came back, I managed to really fake it till you make it and got into radio and television. And I was so fortunate. And so when the show I was doing was axed, it was right before, it was the mid-90s. And I started making documentaries. And then, of course, there was the call-out for the Olympics and the Cultural Olympiad, which occurs 4 years out from every Olympics, to gear up the nation. They were calling for, people to come and work for them. And they approached me 6 times. And, of course, it was that time where we were going, oh, the Olympics, they're going to celebrate white culture and, that sort of thing. So a lot of the community were going, do we get involved in this? Anyway, I went in and had a meeting with them, and then I realised we actually could have an opportunity here. And so I went back and talked to a few people and said, should I take this job? And they go, no, don't take it. Oh, my God, you'll be crucified, Imagine what the community's going to think. And on the 6th visit, which I'm blown away because I didn't really have the skills of running an event, and but I guess a budget's a budget, right? And so I went in for a meeting, and they just started setting up the office. And I'm looking around, and I thought, no, we need to be here. This is a platform. And then they told me what I was going to be paid. Oh, well, I sold my soul. I said, yes, absolutely. It's the best I've ever been paid working in the arts, so I knew it wouldn't last long. And that was so important because it gave us the opportunity to, do festivals in the lead up, and those festivals all were embedded with our culture. But to start the first one with the Festival of the Dreaming, and oh my God, I can even remember the board going, are you sure you could run this for, I think it went for 3 weeks. Are you sure you could run it because you wouldn't have enough content? And I went, okay, are you kidding? So I commissioned 7 solo plays. It was fabulous because they had so much money. So we could actually do a lot of stuff that had been around but hadn't had the opportunity to be developed and things like that. So I learnt a lot from that. But the beautiful thing we had, oh my God, we had this bar called Barbadoo, which is bar on the water. And so every night we had an act in there, and it became, Club Central. And everyone wanted to perform there. So they go to have a drink and they go, oh, can we get up on the... It was amazing. But the biggest thing about it was, I hate to use the term, but it was a bloody melting pot. There was no one looking at someone and going, yeah, what do you want? Or it was just people laughing, smiling. A few babies out of that. And, but people were connecting. And so that made me realise, when I looked at that Barbadoo, I went, people want to gather. People don't know about us because where do they meet us? And they've been told they should fear us. But this clearly wasn't happening at Barbadoo. So it was a wonderful thing to be able to give people work within the arts, but to actually see people gathering, no matter their gender, religion, colour, it didn't matter. People were gathering because they wanted to celebrate that genre of art. It was so exciting. And of course, then we went, the world's ready. And so then I invested that time in developing the Dreaming Festivals, which I did for 21 years.
And I think just sharing that, and also going back those big gatherings, I think it's very undervalued, the Festival of the Dreaming, and then also what came those 2 years after with the opening and Awaken and putting Aboriginal culture. Yeah, Aboriginal culture has always been on the world stage to limiting effects, but the impact particularly on Sydney, as opposed to 12 years before with 88 and big gatherings there, which, there was a lot of ceremonial stuff, and Uncle Arch, tells all of those wonderful stories, like one of the first times he actually performed,
Yes, the
took the children, and all of that. But that's something quite confronting to people, and also what led. So I think just to value the significance of that, and also where that came from, and country was so embedded. So that importance of country. I'm going to continue to chop and change to that, because just on the focus of country, I don't know whether a lot of people, they see what you do and all of that, and it's something that I've really sort of relished with your ability, and that how you actually live up home on country, and the importance of that. And look, me, as people here know, I try to regularly go back home. And people sort of say, how, that 5-hour drive up and back to Tamworth and all of that. But that significance of grounding and that, can you just share a bit of that and what that means to you?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Our lands are pretty special, right? And, one of the great elders was my father. And he had set up an organisation called the Bundjalung Tribal Society, and he had 3 things he wanted to do. One was to get accessible housing, so he bought 35 houses across Lismore and rented them out to Aboriginal people at very cheap rates, but it was rent to buy. So now all those people own their own house. The second was that he realised that we were self-medicating, and we had so many issues in our local communities. We have many missions across our communities. It's pretty fabulous, but we're all pretty fucked, So he set up the Namatjira Haven, which was a drug and alcohol counselling service, and a home where people out in the bush, where people can go and be on country. And that, I watched him doing that. I watched him and Mum going around with real estates, looking at places in Lismore. And everyone said no when they knew it was going to be an Aboriginal safe place. So they had to go out and buy farmland and actually build it because, the fear of Lismore. So there was a part of me that, I hate Lismore, you redneck, I never really want to live here. But I wanted to live on the outskirts of Lismore. And damn, I didn't buy that house. But anyway. And then one of the great days of my life was 1988 with Dad and Nana Walker and all of those senior people walking with us. And then Dad had this vision. His third vision was that we needed a newspaper to write our stories so people could see our lens. And I remember it when I used to say, I'm going to be a journalist. Go, don't worry, darling, we'll have a newspaper for you. Dad, expectations. I thought we were going to be a dynasty of, But anyway, he appointed this young man, Owen Courage. They set up the board and away they went. Of course, Dad's relationships with the local outlet, the Northern Star, and the Courier Mail was born. And it's still made in the old Northern Star offices in Lismore. And it was extraordinary. And just seeing my father And, he was getting old, but I never saw him as old. And on the night of the anniversary of the Koori Mail, my dad was the keynote speaker. And they had this young man they'd hired and gave a lot of money to be the MC. But he'd met a couple of cousins out the back, and Yandi's very fine where we come from. And the poor lad probably hadn't had that strength of Yandi and a few beers before he went on because he was nervous. So he was completely off his face. And someone came and said, "Oh, Rhoda, can you get up and MC?" I said, "No, I'm here to celebrate the Koori Mail." But it was extraordinary because I had to introduce my father. And my father died that night. It was quite extraordinary, like it completely centered me. And he spoke. He was such a great orator, and he spoke of country and what that country meant to him, because that was his life. He'd been there all his life, except for when he went to study overseas, but that was his country. And he knew every area of it. And so there was a part of me going, "Oh, I should come home." But of course I didn't have the money or anything. But years later, anyway, shut up. I'm terrible telling stories. But I go home because, I have a great family. We're very dysfunctional, proudly so. And my twin sister was a hairdresser. And with my nursing background, we were going to travel the world. And she was going to do hairdressing and I was going to do... But that didn't eventuate. She had a car accident. And so my mum, she wasn't coping and she had to have rehabilitation. So after her spending 2 years in a rehab centre to learn to walk and everything in Hornsby, she went home, and I knew that I had to sort of be there to help Mum and everything. So we managed, with my best friend at the time, David Field, we bought a farm, 100-acre farm. I don't know, I think we'd seen too many movies, and we were going to have this farm and then come in. And then we're like, what the hell do we do with this farm? We're not farmers. And so we had to bring in people to help us, which was fantastic. But what it did was it got me back on country, and I was able to be very close to my sister and my cousins and families and brothers and all that. And being on country, actually, I don't know, it was a great gift because I was raising I've gone a few years, but anyway, my sister had a baby, but welfare were going to take that baby. And so my mother pushed for the kinship system within welfare, and I was never having children. And my mum asked, would I consider taking this baby? And of course, I'd been married for, a few years. And so Bill and I sat up and did the pros and cons and went home, got a 4-day-old baby. Lucky I'd been a nurse, I tell you. And away we went. So we had this place to go to on country. And so then eventually I just started commuting back and forth, which I still do. But everyone thinks I live in Sydney. And I don't say anything, but yeah.
And I think the funny thing is, I get this a lot as well. That's when you recharge as well, and the importance. And I think, having Aboriginal people working with you and all of that sits within us, and that's so important. And that's the value and the benefit that you actually get out from those strong contacts and connections back in country. So I'm going to move it on and sort of, ramp it up a little bit to get. So a lot of the work that you've done, a lot of the areas, and look, we only have a bit of time. We don't have 10 hours to go through your
I'll be short and
whole
succinct.
career. Yeah. Well, this is more about how much you've bloody done, Rhoda. But this term, a lot of the work, we hear a lot about resilience and culture, and you've talked about a lot of things of survival and resilience, and I don't really like resilience. Like we hear it, everyone celebrates our resilience, and to me that's just a bit grinding of, oh, so you're just happy with our survival and we're never able to flourish and all of that. It's more about the strength. But going through a lot of your work, those key drivers of what you bring, and you've talked about the Festival of the Dreaming and the Cultural Olympiad. Can you choose one of those? And I've got a bit of a list. Parrtjima, Boomerang Festival, of course. Your work at Sydney Opera House and those significant, dance rights, as well as, I think it was called Songlines before Bundjalung.
No, Songline was for Vivid, which is on the Western South, and Bundjalung was on the Eastern South. 365 days a year. Is it still, Fiona? Yeah.
Still there?
Every night.
Yeah. And then, of course, Sydney New Year's Eve and that. Can you actually choose one of those bits of work that, at its very, what was your key driver?
Can I give you two?
Yep.
Because we have shifted, and the fact that you're all here to hear us talk is incredible. And yes, there was resilience, but it's about progress. So, on the night of the opening ceremony of the Sydney 2000 Olympics, I'd had the extraordinary opportunity. I'd gone by myself. I can't believe it. I'd gone around the country by myself with an idea of what that segment, the awakening segment, was going to be. And I went to Numbulwar, and I didn't know anyone in there. I knew one person, but the minute I mentioned my dad's name, the doors opened. And it happened in two places, at Numbulwar and in the Kimberleys. So the late Mr. Nundrabilla started singing me. I said to him, I want the flag song, because everywhere we have a flag dance. And so I want this. And I showed him the picture, Tommy McRae's picture of, the arrival here. And a year later, they're doing a corroboree. And, of course, they're doing the flag dance. And the white fellas that were dancing with them had their top hats on. And then, of course, all the other artwork that depicted flag dance. And so I said to him, I really want a flag dance song. Anyway, he sang Dimmeroo. Oh, my God, I closed my eyes. We're sitting on the beach at Numbulwar. And honestly, if I'd played it to anyone, it almost sounded like an Indian chant. It was so ancient. Weird I say that, but it was so ancient. It was so beautiful. And I just looked at him and I said, oh, Mr. Nundabilla, that's our song. He said, yes, we want to gift it. And, it's extraordinary. And then I went to the Kimberley to look at what we could do. And, oh, my God, they're going on about the Mimi, that Mimi show we did in the Dreaming, which was brilliant. They're going, oh, yes, we want Mimis. I said, we've done Mimis. Let's go for Wandjina. And, of course, no one had seen them. It was really at that time where they were... The late Mr. Sam Woolagudja had passed the knowledge on to his son, the late Donnie Woolagudja. And so he had permission to paint these and take them out to the world. And so, oh my gosh, Mr. Woolagudja, incredible. He had that thin little grey moustache like Valentino. And he goes, yes, Rhoda. Anyway, we're sitting in Arnhem Land. I took him to meet all the Dillocks of Arnhem Land. And it was amazing watching these men. They knew. They had never met, but they just knew that they were boss men and women, And he just sits there and draws this, and he goes, what do you think about this? This one's Namra Lily. And I went, that's it. And so when we raised that Wandjina, he turned to me. I was sitting there with him, and he just turned to me, had tears in his eyes, and he grabbed my hand. This is a senior lawman. He goes, thanks for your trust in me. Thanks for trusting me with your, And then he said, look at her, Namra Lily. And then he said something in language, and the tears were just falling as we will send her out to the world. It is good. The spirit will change this country. And so, wow, that was 2000. And then 2023. incredible people I get to work with on the Parrtjima Festival in Central Australia, the Arrernte, and there are 3 estates of Mwantua, Alice Springs, and the Central Arrernte prided themselves when white man came on their cultural abilities and the essence of what that country was. And it's a central place in the heart of the nation. And so there's lots of people that come in from other country. And of course, like any city, it has those issues, self-medication, people coming in, they come in for court or hospital and then they can't get home. And in 2023, we saw this nation, well, we'll blame the media. We saw the media showcase Alice Springs that looked like Detroit without any understanding and just going, this is Alice Springs. The place where everyone used to come to Australia to hear Arrernte, to see Arrernte culture. It was the stopover before you went out back. And here were the men and women that I've been working with for 7 years, the senior boss men and women, the custodians of those 3 estates, devastated because they said, this is not us. And one of the visiting groups from another nation, they said, well, they're coming in here and that's their behaviour, but it's not ours. And we talked about, should we go ahead with the festival? Because the media were making out that this was a no-go zone, and a lot of people did cancel their travel for that festival this year. And I sat down with them and I said, well, it's up to you guys, but maybe we should cancel because people are, you know. And that old man, well, he's not, Benedict Stevens, he's not old, but he's the custodian. He grabbed my hand and he said, Rhoda, this is not us. Culture is us. It is everything. I said, what do you think? He said, we need to show them who we are. And so we did. And it was like, seriously, it was like this gentleness, this calmness came across that town. Everybody was there. Like, the community, the black and white community who came together. There were some elements, but, you know, people are good people, you know. It's a tough town to live in. They recognise the issues and they tried to deal with it like any of us would as a community. But it was pretty special out there, and I think it was special because I wanted to find something that we were talking about. What would be the installation, the main installation? It's a light festival. What would be the main installation that the nation is what we're doing? And of course, if you look around that Statement of the Heart from 2017, there was an artwork that was around that was designed by a number of the women at Widjabul, Ananu women, and Reni Kulicha was one of those artists who I have the highest regard, and it's a story, it's the women's story of the Mala, a story of Uluru. And the women had come to me, and I'd gone and had a few chats with them because they were really concerned that Australia was feeling they didn't understand why those women pushed and pushed to close the climb on Uluru. And it wasn't because they didn't want people climbing that amazing monument, but it was because they were taking personal responsibility for anyone who died at Uluru, like you do. Aboriginal people take responsibility for people who die on their country. But what Australians don't realise is I sat and talked to the Ulurus, Mr. Reggie Uluru and Mr. Cassidy, and there were families from Murri that ever since that climb's been open and, you know, all the people that have died, they would get their names and addresses. A lot of them were international visitors, and they would save up enough money and they would go visit their homeland, knock on the door and say, we were deeply sorry that your husband or whoever died on our country. And that's a personal responsibility. And people didn't even realise, and they couldn't do it anymore. They just didn't want to do it anymore. They didn't want to carry that cultural load. And so that was another reason why the climb was closed. So those ladies were talking to me going, but the Inma, that women's python story is really important, and we want to share that. And the senior Inma singer had been a young woman who'd come to the Sydney Olympics as one of those ladies that did, 346 ladies from 21 Aboriginal communities across the APY lands that came and danced at the Olympics. And she said, oh, I'd love to. And so she gifted us that Inma for that song. So when I knew that and put the painting there, it was like this incredible story. But it was also that's what we were talking about. We were talking about the statement of the heart and who we were, and I just wanted to really honour it. So this year's Parrtjima was like, I felt the same effect that day when our Kathy won the gold, and as Australians, we were on top of the world. We thought we were the greatest. And I have to say, black fellas went, oh my God, they get it. They're the host of the oldest race. How fabulous. Let's bring out that tourism now. This is why we're different. But that didn't have that effect. But that euphoria that I felt at the Olympics and could see that the world was changing, I felt that in Alice Springs this year. And it was our culture, our art, our story, being given a platform to be heard in the song, in the ceremony, in the art, in the story, in the humour. I had Stephen Oliver there, in the humour. If I had to pick two, it'd be those. And of course, I love doing all of them.
Yeah.
But it's bringing people together.
And I guess just on those points, sharing culture is so important. But for us, it's giving a gift, and there's a reason why we do that. And I think for those in the audience, and it's an interesting point whether you're part of a sector that puts on these shows or produces content and that, or an audience that actually brings it. This is one of those things of, really embracing that gift through a real understanding of that. And that understanding is keeping that strong cultural foundation there. But the other challenge of it in this modern world and the systems that we actually sit in, and even our, I think there's, research projects called bums on seats and all of that. It's that thing of which doesn't really fit culture as a commodity. So, I don't know, this is a loaded question. I could take it there. Lots of different. Why is sharing culture important? Or just on that, how do we get a balance? Is there a balance? And I always talk about the work we do here. We need to move away by embracing a First Nations way of being is about relationships. And sometimes those relationships takes lots of time and not transactional one-off. And that's the deepness and richness, and that's the gift that we have. And I always liken it to when I talk about my country and in those past, Bora ceremony, which is that special ceremony that we have, bringing, I don't talk about women's business, but young boys into manhood to be parts of society and that, and in general. And people always say, you hear these, ceremonial grounds and that, and people think, it's like, you go and maybe overnight and there's, a few dances and that and that. Our Bora ceremonies go anywhere from 9 to 12 months. That those boys, it's an ongoing ceremony. It's a passage of life, and I think that's where we, not wanting to go too bad because I want to throw it over to you, Rhoda, but that cultural foundation of how is there a balance? Is there, is that a struggle in terms of serving it up? And I'll get to the other point of that later because it's going somewhere.
Yeah, it's going somewhere, but it's a really hard one. It's a fine line. I've copped shit over the years for, you just exploit culture. I just want to be a facilitator, and I want to make sure that we never lose that culture. A lot of the people I work with, they see the song line, the dance, whatever it is, as a gifting. But because of reclamation, of ensuring the maintenance continues of that songline or whatever it is. So there is the transaction. And we actually saw that, particularly with what we refer to as the Western Desert movement, when we saw those works in the 70s and Parrtjima coming about, and all of a sudden there was an economic independence for Aboriginal people painting art, particularly in the Western Central Desert region, and that whole thing took off. And so all of a sudden we saw buses in communities that could take the kids to school. We saw, independence. People were able to buy a motor car or whatever it was. So there is the transaction, but there's also that sits beside the transaction. And maybe a lot of white fellas think, oh, transaction beauty, I'll get this dance group out, I'll make a bit of money on them. But it's not like that really. But then there's the stewardship, I guess, could be the word. So these two sit side by side, because if we don't have the stewardship, we can't have the transaction. And I don't want to exploit culture, but we are in a time that is so vital, I'm terrified. I used to really worry when, wherever I was and someone would say, oh yeah, I know that bit, but we don't know the next bit because they were all taken, or there's this old man in Broome that knows that song of that for safekeeping. He can tell this mob what that dance is or that song. But he's old and he's sitting in a nursing home, and you go, oh my God, what happens if he dies? That's an library. So I really think about going out and talking and recording and making sure in whatever was appropriate for that community that somehow, and Fiona would know, dance rights, right? It was an opportunity to get that next generation to start learning from their old people. But it gave the old people pride, and everyone needs to be needed. And so that old man that held that song for that community just up past Broome, he was in the wheelchair when those boys came. Albert came and asked him and said, can you tell us this song? Can you teach us? And by the end of it, there is no wheelchair. He is laughing and he's dancing with them. But if you saw the first image of that old man, you'd think he was going to die. And, so it was a wonderful thing. There's that reclamation, but I think I learned to always, young people are amazing, They're just incredible. They are great teachers. And I always think of that way that a lot of the old people will say, how do you learn? Sit in the circle. No one above you, no one below you, no one behind you, no one in front of you. You're side by side. So we're all in this together. And then they would, say, this is what we're going to learn. And it's old to young and young to old. And, we learn from young people, how do you do this on your mobile phone? I mean, it's a modern day message stick. But one of the things is there was, we have such extraordinary people in Bangarra Dance Theatre, and NASDA, our incredible dance college, has given culture and brought bridges from the north to the south and reconnected those song lines. And extraordinary, right? We all know Jakapora, Munyarian, and oh my God, we are so lucky. Everyone has gifted everyone. But there was this amazing dancer that we actually got to work on a project we were working at the Sydney Opera House, Hidden Stories. And he hadn't done any acting or anything, but he was this incredible performer. And oh my God, he did such a good job in this little piece we did. And anyway, because he wanted to leave Bangara, there's a lot of touring and. And I said to him, why would you leave one of the most prestigious dance companies in the world that you get to tour? And he said, oh, I love it. But he said, I'm an Aboriginal man. And he said, we're looking at trying to create new dance pieces when we have dance pieces that are being lost and dying. So he said, I made a decision. I will reclaim and maintain those song lines and those dances. And I went, yeah, because are we going to be the generation that we've had thousands of years of eons of oral story, the ceremony associated with that story, the songline associated, and we're just going to get rid of it because we want to do fusion work? Or are we going to be the generation that we make sure we do not lose eons of oral story? And that really impacted me. That was only a few years ago, and it's really made me think how I frame work now and what is the priority and what do I want to do. Yes, I want to have that young, relevant voice, but oh my God, when you see young people, the Warrabinda group that won, oh God, I should know the name of them anyway, they're bloody brilliant. And we really pushed that the young men from 15 to the 25-year-old try and get involved in dance rights, because they're the men that have to navigate daily a narrative that is not theirs. And they're invisible, they're lost, but they're our warriors. Anyway, they put this dance group together at Warrabinda and they won this particular year. They were so dynamic, but they really were pristine about tradition. And it had to be like this. And the old songman's like, nope, got to be like this. There was no room for... And I really liked that. It was, it shocked me a bit, but it was fantastic. Anyway, they did this dance and they won. When it was announced they won, these young men fell to that sand. And they grabbed that sand and they looked up at me and they were bawling their eyes out. They never thought it would be possible. And the crowd is cheering, and it's the most extraordinary experience for them. People applauding them, and then all of a sudden people wanting to embrace them. Half of them had never been hugged because they were useless. They were never going to amount to anything. This is what it was extraordinary. And they had a women's group as well, and they had this young woman who learnt all their old songs from the ladies. And afterwards, she had a really good voice, because where I come from, oh God, we've got a few good singers, but the beauty about learning Aboriginal women's songs, it's all monotone, so you don't need to sing. Anyway, this girl was amazing, and we went up and we said, oh my God, you've really got a fantastic voice. Have you ever thought of... She was 16. She said, oh, this is the first time. It's the first time I sung in public. 3 years later, she won the Best New Talent at the National Indigenous Music Awards. And she's gone on to have a great career. Maisha, you might have heard of her. And so that's what dance rights gave. And so that, I guess, really sits with me, that the culture is our identity. Yeah, we are Australian, but that's what gives me my identity. Yeah, I got Irish, Welsh, Scottish, Anglo in me. It's fabulous. No wonder I loved Europe. But that is who I am here, because that's what I was told. Just this half-caste person who wasn't going to amount to anything. And to be embraced in the arts sector, well, they are the true allies. It's always the artist that shows the mirror of society. It's always the artist that questions the status quo. So our governments can talk forever, but we know our artists are going to put something, whether they're white or black, they're going to put something on the stage, something in our films that's going to show us who we should be and who we can be. I'll shut up now.
I'm just trying to work out. There's a couple of areas that I want to go, but I think the most, and I do want to keep time for some questions. So I might just jump into, I was immediately thinking about dance rights when I was asking that. I think, we're seeing a lot, things have changed, places that we've worked in, understanding, there's great mechanisms like RAPs and strategies, and, we have one here. There's an increased awareness of needing to do things differently. Still a bit of uncertainty, unsure of how to actually do that. And I think if you get a bunch of black fellas in a room where you have all the answers, and I think, I've been in many conversations with you, Rhoda, over the years of those answers and that. And I think one of those, this term of cultural sovereignty, and we hear about sovereignty, but that cultural sovereignty, for us to manage our own culture and that. So in that, we have great, you talked about, some of the work with Sydney Opera House. We have a wonderful show up here. I work in the Museums of History, New South Wales. We've worked in a lot of different organisations, but in terms of cultural sovereignty, when do we get our place that we can call our own? And I liken that to, for those of you who don't, Rhoda and I have worked together to try and develop a New South Wales or a national Aboriginal cultural centre for New South Wales, which is not a new concept. It's been around from Tullagulla days in the 80s right up to present. But we're still not there. There's been multiple discussions, a national Aboriginal theatre, so when do we get our place? Which is a loaded question, but how good would it be? What would it look like? What would it be? And if you can answer that in...
I'm going to answer it really short. It's about maturity and growth. And like those old people trust me now with their art, I can do anything because they know I will come back and ask and seek and be guided and be open. I will accept the truth and how they want that story to be told. New South Wales is the gateway to Aboriginal Australia. New South Wales is the first contact point, and we fucking survived. I come from a community where we've never lost our language. We've always had Bundjalung speakers. They just did it quietly because it was outlawed. But what extraordinary heroes that they kept our language. My father started a language centre in the 50s and it went underground. Thank you. We have our language and it gives us so much information. New South Wales is the only state or territory in this goddamn country that does not have an arts centre that is funded and supported by federal government. If you go anywhere else in any other state and territory, they have peak bodies that look after Desart, a peak body for the art centres, 45 plus art centres across the central and western APY desert lands. Anchor, the peak body from the Kimberleys across the top end for all those art centres. And I go on, the Queen Ayaka, and they're everywhere except here. And so when you go to Darwin Art Fair, they have a map as you enter. It's extraordinary. Get to Darwin Art Fair. It's amazing. But you go there and there's every state and territory with the dot things of where the art centres are, and we're just naked. We deserve. Our culture is incredible because it actually has survived. It is our sovereign right to tell our stories. It is our sovereign right to decide how we want to showcase who we are. But it is our sovereign right and our obligation that we make sure if you're living on this country and if you lived in the old way, We do not dismiss. We don't have a word for visitor. We actually invite you in. We give you a family. We give you a name because you have to have a position in the community. So I go looking at those old frameworks and I say, if we had a New South Wales cultural arts centre, whatever it is, can you only imagine? It's not just about us. It's about us telling the stories. They should be from our lens, but imagine the collaborations. I could rattle off 5 stories now that are the most extraordinary stories. The Backhouse girls. You heard of people with the name Backhouse? The surname Backhouse? You've heard of Mile Creek? Okay, so that guy, Backhouse, was a dickhead and went and massacred all these people because he had a problem, probably a psychopath. They heard what they thought was a dog whimpering after the Mile Creek because he was killed at Mile Creek. They think he's tied up his dog while he's gone off to disperse the Aboriginals. And they go and there's no dog. They hear the whimpering. They open the basement of this guy's, shack, and there are the girls all tied up. They were the Backhouse girls that he would use for his pleasure. And of course all the kids were called Backhouse and they got the name Backhouse. Just one story, but that's a shared story. It's a terrible story. It's a dark history story. It's the truth telling. And on Wiradjuri lands, there's a gentleman who sees that Wonderine is this amazing, did I say that right? Wonderine? Yeah. Amazing warrior. And they have this incredible society. But he's putting his cotton farm there and he realises, he's losing there. So he offers help and he gives them a place. And that man, that farming dynasty, 5th generation or whatever they were, they saw what was happening over the years. They always employed the blackfellas. And then he realised they had this extraordinary culture. So he gave them money to set up a paper mill. Remember and all these aunties and gentlemen came together and they did their designs on this incredible paper. Oh my God, it burnt down. But he took community and gave them back expression. So there are these extraordinary stories too of the artwork anyway, there's lots that's in this. So it's not just about us, but we need to have the ownership of it. We need to have the sovereign right to tell the story how our custodians want it told. But we should be sharing always. God, I sounded like a preacher then.
Well, the last bit, and I put in my notes, future dreaming. So if we can just, before we open up for questions, where are we going with a shared future? So, and I always like, for us, and I've sat at many a blue sky table and all of that. And the unfortunate thing is, what is the future? Where are we going? But we get brought together to come up with all the things that we can ask permission for. Not what we need, what we should have, or what we're going to take control. So in terms of embracing a bit of future dreaming, can you tell us what you think the future looks like in, let's say, 5 years, 10 years? In terms of 3 key things. And if we can keep it nice and...
Yeah, I'll try. I will. Promise.
Okay, say in 5 years, what does country look like in terms of our dreaming? What does culture look like? And what does community, both our mob and the rest, for a shared future?
In 5 years, country will be replenished. It'll be honoured. People will know every name of country. In 5 years, the children that are now learning the stories, because it's normalised in schools, will be telling their newborn children those stories. in 5 years, what was the on community? Well, we'll have our cultural centre, but we will be undergoing a process of really getting to know each other and really tackling the truth-telling. And we can do it. You mentioned it earlier. We were all told this land was terra nullius. And then when we unpacked it and actually learnt the truth, we didn't have a problem with it. We didn't fear it. It was truth and we accepted it because it was done rightly. I think in 5 years we need to dissipate the fear. No one wants to divide this nation. We want to grow this nation because it is the oldest. Oh my God, you know, can you imagine? Come to the oldest place on the planet. We'll have every tourism opportunity in the world. We don't need to go underground to develop resources. There's more than mining. Our arts and culture actually brings in more money than mining, but people don't think that. They think, you know, what was the other one? Community.
Country, culture and community. I think you've had them all.
I think the day when Australians, you know, we saw Parrtjima do it, where they can do the haka, they can speak the language. A lot of them, you know, every institution and government body in New Zealand answers the phone bilingually. We can do that. Yeah, we have more. Of course, we're better. But, you know, if we can learn our regions, it brings us back to community. We are an incredible nation. We just never recognise it because we need to get over ourselves. We've cut the apron strings. Well, soon we will with King Charlie, but, you know, we have seen devastation across this country. We saw devastation of massacres. We saw devastation of all of a sudden the entire planet of our country changed. We never had droughts until the sheep came, but we dealt with it. We deal with it every season. We deal with fires. We deal with terrible disasters. We deal with flooding. And what do? There is no colour. We extend our hands, we lift everyone up and we say, hey, we're in this together. I know that sounds really wanky, but shit, we can do it. We've got to stop politicians for their own commercial gain dividing and ruling us. Because our convict stock told us we were no good. The blackfella stock told us we're no good. But look at us, we're all still here. A lot of us have got together in more ways than one. Let me tell you should see my kids. The best of both worlds. So if we really can be open and not fall into that, you know, I'm sorry, Peter, but just what we're seeing on our screens, oh, God forgive me, but it's about divide and rule. I don't know what people are so frightened of. Why are they frightened that if we wanted to express language, how's that going to hurt someone? We're not going to take the houses back. They have freehold title. We live under the Westminster system. During the native title determinations that have occurred across the country, I have not seen one Hills hoist taken. I mean, really. So we've got to get rid of the fear. I don't know what we fear, and we can get rid of it. Do you remember a few years ago when we went to vote for marriage equality? And we look back now and go, why did we fear that people would fall in love and, you know? So hopefully in 5 years we'll be going, oh my God, why did we fear the truth-telling?
So I did say that was the last question, but I'm going to slip into, and we've got a little bit of time, but so 2 questions. What did you think of Rhoda's dream? And this is to you guys, the audience. And if you do think that that's a good dream to have, what are you all personally going to do about to make it happen? And that's an open question just to leave you with it. But for now, we do have a couple of minutes for any questions.
Any questions?
Otherwise, we can keep talking. No.
And I'm really sorry, I'm very nervous, so I I waffle when I'm nervous. I get. Oh, didn't I? You didn't.
Great storyteller.
Hi. You mentioned apron strings. No, we've just got a new king, King Charles. What impact of that change from Queen Elizabeth to King Charles will help the people of country here?
What with the change of the monarch?
Well, you mentioned cutting apron strings. Do you think that will happen quicker, or what do you?
I guess I was being a bit, do we consider republic?
Yeah.
But the big thing is, it's a very difficult one because many Aboriginal communities, when Princess Diane passed away, our communities grieved her deeply because she was the boss woman's daughter-in-law. So a lot of Aboriginal people see the monarchy in the respect of how they would look at their custodial leaders. So, Elizabeth was the boss woman of that country, so they respect. And today, King Charles is the boss man of that country. But I do think that we know we're very different and that perhaps we'll be moving towards a republic, maybe. That'll be the next referendum, I think.
Thank you. I should say that I've been doing a lot of work in Parramatta over the last few years as an architect and a planner. The old jail at Parramatta, I think, sits on Aboriginal land as a result of a land title swap. So there's a place for the centre that you were talking about. It's a bit of a paradox, convert a colonial jail into an Aboriginal cultural centre, but it could be a goer. I think there's some questions out there that are still looking for answers. I should also say that over the past couple of months, there's been a few coincidences. Some of you may not have ever heard of an outfit called the Greater Cities Commission. Well, the Greater Cities Commission is no longer a separate entity of government. It's been absorbed into the Department of Planning, but it has set up an Aboriginal Advisory Committee, which for the first time seems to be accessible to government and to community groups and to people in the street. I think it's the first step forward that a New South Wales government has taken to establish such a group. There's also Stan Grant's book. There's also the release of a report about the inadequacies of our heritage legislation when it comes to dealing with Aboriginal culture. That report recently came out of the State Government Heritage Office. It's been reviewed by the National Trust. The National Trust has some serious concerns about gaps, including a very weak attempt to deal with Aboriginal culture in our heritage legislation. So there's a few things there that have recently happened, and I think that maybe now is the time to place the flag on the jail at Parramatta. It's not a question. I mean, it's not a question. It's a suggestion, I suppose.
Yeah.
But maybe there is a question there with these coincidences of publications and the growth of NAIDOC Week, of course. So now's the time.
Yeah, and yeah, looking and there's also those of you who may have seen the recent news of some old news of the transfer of Memel, Goat Island, to Aboriginal community. So there is a lot of movement and a lot of traction. I think the key thing for me personally, and I have to be very careful because I'm a New South Wales public servant, but first and foremost, as I always say, I'm a Gamilaroi Murri from northwest New South Wales, and I take my cultural obligations very, very seriously. I also operate under cultural probity. I think the Parramatta Jail was actually handed over to Darubin Land Council, so that is a private, well, not a private, they're a statutory body under New South Wales legislation. Whether that fits within the needs and wants of the broader Aboriginal community, also New South Wales. But I also take your point in the new reference group, the First Nations reference group. But this is a thing that particularly we're doing here at the Museum of History New South Wales, of a new form of engagement and working with Aboriginal people, not at them. And I think the first and foremost step that we all have is to really, and what you can gather from Rhoda is to really understand what Aboriginal communities are, the difference, the colonial impact, how things have changed, the social structures, and what we're here today, and how to navigate that in dealing with it. Because one of the unfortunate things, I wholeheartedly support that reference group, and it's great to actually have it, but it's very, very upsetting to me as a Gamilaroi Murri from New South Wales that has the honour and the obligation that I carry day in and day out with my family of living and working on someone else's country and land, that only one person on that advisory committee comes from this country, this local country, let alone this state. Yes, they may call this home. So from a cultural perspective, there is an issue of agency and authority, of how we work together. And I think part of that big challenge is we are very different in ourselves when we talk about, that's why the terminology First Nations is picking more and more, that we are nations and that. But embracing that, there is movements. It's just making sure that we go in the right way, that you're getting a bit, and that's where that strong cultural foundations, I think, is what we talked about and Rhoda, honed in on so much is so important. I think we're way over time, so, but luckily the CEO, our new CEO, Mary Darwell is here, so she's not saying pack it down. So, but look, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's always, an honour to share a floor with Rhoda, and share some of this with you all. I'd just like to invite you to show your gratitude to the gift that Rhoda has given. And thank you all for being here to be part of this night. As I said, this is one of our First Nations speaker series, and I might hand over to Bob White, who's our head of programming and productions.
Thanks, Peter.
I'm going to put you on the spot to give a bit of an insight into what's coming.
What's coming up, yes. So thanks everyone for coming along. This is our monthly First Nations speaker series, and we are really excited on the 3rd of August to be presenting our next speaker series in partnership with the Sydney Opera House, and it will actually be hosted by the Opera House. So we'll be having a conversation moderated by Rudy Bremer, looking at reflections on performance at the house. We've got a number of special guests that will be coming, so I'll leave you to look online to find out a little bit more about that, but that's another one of our free events in the Utsen Room, and you can book online, and we'll be really excited to welcome you there.
And can we thank Peter? Peter's actually done so much work at that strategic planning level and within the public service. I can't name everything you've done, but biggest thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Rhoda. Thank you, and see you at the next speaker series.